Welcome back. Here we are for the final installment of the breakdown of the false inquiry on Doc Jamieson. Thanks for joining us as we continue revealing how corrupt racing officials abuse their power to victimize and attempt to silence those with integrity in order to protect their illegal race rigging enterprise and their own self-interests, and the systemic corruption responsible for covering it all up. First up, we're going to rewind a bit and recap on how this all started, with greyhound trainer Narelle Mulcahy and her partner Bill Samuels, who didn't appreciate Doc interfering in and disrupting their race rigging with his superior training and racing, and who colluded with GRA official Kerry Watson in setting up a false inquiry on Doc. Kerry, who needed to have Doc silenced from his exposing of industry corruption and its facilitation of not only high-level race fixing, but also the most abhorrent animal cruelty and widespread killing of greyhounds. To kick things along, here is the obligatory proof of Bill and Narelle having escaped jail time and being banned from greyhound racing, still racing even after being implicated in the killing of 55 greyhounds. As we've already thoroughly illustrated in the previous two videos, Bill and Narelle are still racing greyhounds because it's in the interest of Racing Queensland to keep them happy so they don't squeal on their collusion with the GRA, the Greyhound Racing Authority, in setting up Doc in a false inquiry in 2007. In the previous video, we gave a nuanced breakdown of the first hearing of the inquiry, blatantly showing how it was a frame job and just how much of a circus it was. After the first hearing in July of 2007 in Bundaberg, the inquiry was shut down and then restarted in Brisbane, where the remainder of the hearings were held. Now, unlike the previous video, we're not going to go into great depth of nuance to break down the hearings that occurred in Brisbane. Unlike the hearing in Bundaberg, which was a clown show, proceedings for hearings held in Brisbane were conducted by the retired Judge Ian Wylie, whose conduct and professionalism was a world apart from that of Cameron McClune's, as was his ability to manoeuvre proceedings more gracefully. Nonetheless, Judge Wylie was, like basically everyone else involved, fully aware of Doc's innocence. Ultimately, Judge Wylie was commissioned to do what Cameron could not, and that was make the inquiry appear legitimate. And given the circumstances, this was an impossible task, but to his credit, Judge Wylie did the best he could with what he had to work with. If you've already seen the previous two videos on this inquiry, you'll be familiar with the allegations against Doc. If not, we recommend going back and watching those first. Links in the description below. But to quickly recap, the primary allegation was that Doc had reportedly claimed to be close friends with GRA chairman of the stewards, Danny Ryan, and also supposedly claiming that as a result of that friendship, Doc was afforded special privileges in the form of not having his dogs swabbed at the races for drug testing, and the remaining allegations were an assortment of elaborate fictions in support of the primary ones, such as Doc supposedly claiming to be reporting to Danny on trouble and happenings at the Bundaberg Club, Doc allegedly pretending to be on the phone to Danny to intimidate others and get his way, and absurd stories of events that never actually happened. Again, see the previous videos for more details on these. While the previous video on this subject was a detailed breakdown of the first hearing held in Bundaberg, in this video we will be fully dismantling the legitimacy of the inquiry as a whole, while referencing the most significant parts of the transcript of the remaining 3 hearings held in Brisbane, and analysing the Reasons for Outcome document by Judge Wylie to showcase the glaringly obvious and very big problems associated with it. Once again, we only have the transcripts to go by because the GRA never actually provided Doc with a copy of the audio tapes. Despite repeatedly requesting them, he was given the runaround, and this was on top of the trouble he had getting copies of just the transcripts, with these requests continuing until well after the inquiry had ended, both of which in the end it turned out to be completely compromised, with the audio tapes reported missing and the integrity of the transcripts broken, with a suspiciously large amount of inaudibles all throughout. And of course, things turned out to align with the advice from ex-steward Bob Watkins that it was common practice for audio tapes to go quote-unquote missing and for transcripts to be typed up as inaudible.
Paul, it's Jonathan from Animal Rescue. Yeah, you guys do transcripts?
We do transcripts for racing industry.
Oh, you do it for Racing Queensland and that, do you?
Racing Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales.
Oh, right, so you usually know Kerry Watson and Danny Ryan, or Danny's dead.
Danny's a great bloke, Danny.
Danny's dead now, so...
Yeah, he was my real gentleman, Danny.
Have you heard the name Cameron McClune? He was a steward. I think he's on the drugs now.
Yeah, Cameron, he's been around a bit. He was thoroughbred, and he was doing some golf there for a while.
Yeah, that's right. That's back when Danny was alive, but...
Yeah, Cameron sort of went off the rails a bit. Yeah.
Because they did say that he was punting and betting as well. And Paul, with transcripts, will you keep a copy?
We keep it for years.
Is there any chance, say one day next week, I could catch up with you and bring some stuff down for you to have a look at?
Yeah, no, that's at 12 o'clock?
Yep.
Okie dokie.
All right, thank you, Paul.
Hi. Oh, hey, Paul.
Hi.
I met you yesterday
Yeah.
with John.
Yeah.
How did you go with the 2007 audio?
No, good.
Not yet?
Look, Paul only types the transcripts. He can't request copies of it. If you want it, you have to go to the stewards and they have to provide it.
I
And
don't-
2007
yeah.
is just...
I've got nothing, no records back that far.
Oh, really?
No.
We keep it for years.
So if
Do
we
you have
can't...
an email address? Because obviously John spoke to you. He wants you to do some transcripts for his
we aren't going
business.
to.
Yeah.
Paul's retiring.
Yeah.
Even though yesterday you said you would be happy to do a couple,
Well,
or...
yeah, but no, I'm thinking no, I don't want to be responsible for any more. I used to be in the Supreme Court, then I went over to the Family Court because it
Oh,
just
wow.
started up, and that's when they had all that trouble there, judges getting shot and all that sort of stuff and
Oh.
everything else. There was a few problems there then, sort of thing, so then I've been doing some the stuff for the races and stuff like that.
Did you end up getting to...
Yes, it was very interesting. He used to work for the Supreme Court,
Oh,
and
my...
he also worked for the Children's Court.
So he's no dummy.
No way.
Wow.
Totally understands it all.
Yeah. Well, he was a bit shattered yesterday, wasn't he? So what did they say?
He doesn't have it. That he's just the transcript, and then he moves it on, and he deletes things, and that you have to go basically to the mother company. It's owned by Racing Queensland. You have to chase them about it.
Are they saying they don't want to do any of my work?
Yes.
Why is that? Because they know we're on to them, eh?
Well, yeah. They're scared.
Yeah, they're scared.
He told me his experience,
Yes.
where he worked and why he got out of the courts.
Why did he get out?
He told me that they were killing judges, so he got out of there.
Killing judges.
Judges, that was his words. He got out of there and went out on his own, and that's where he started doing transcripts for obviously Racing Queensland and other states, which he's been doing for 30 years on his own.
Yeah. So, no doubt, maybe he changed the transcript for him, eh?
Highly possible.
Yeah. Oh, well, we've thrown a cat amongst the pigeons, haven't we?
Nonetheless, no matter how much they've been altered, there's no hiding the truth. Now, as we've already pointed out in previous videos, the intent of the GRA has always been to silence Doc by way of intimidation, harassment and sabotage, and the false inquiry was, although a major one, just one part. But there was plenty more. To begin with, until 1998, the GRA had no power over Doc. Until then, Doc had been working within the greyhound racing industry for his entire life without ever becoming a licensee. His services were on offer to greyhound trainers and owners, but he never held any kind of registration with the GRA. So in order to gain power over Doc, the GRA forced him to become a licensee in 98 by refusing any further access to racetracks unless he was registered, which made him subject to industry legislation and the rules of racing. Even before the false inquiry, there was a host of false complaints against Doc, and his properties were subjected to surprise inspections on numerous occasions, passing with flying colours each time, of course, because his kennels and the care of his animals were always immaculate and of the highest standard. As we illustrated previously, by 2006, Danny Ryan became weary with having to constantly look for dirt on a man that never had any, and just wanting to see an end to it all, gave Doc a tip-off about Kerry Watson, the, at the time, GRA Deputy Chair, planning to come after him through her connections in the Chiropractors Board of Queensland, and also with a false GRA inquiry. From 2003, his trouble with the Chiropractic Board had already begun, with complaints about using chiropractic-associated wording in his advertising. This is the article referenced in the original complaint. As you can see, it clearly references animals and not humans, but the Chiropractors Board of Queensland took issue with the fact that it didn't specifically mention the term animals, which eventually led to a lawsuit, and as we already showed in the previous videos, later in May of 2007, Doc won the case by virtue of the grandfather clause, predating the Chiropractors Registration Act by 5 years, securing him every right to use chiro-related terms in his advertising and go back after the board for defamation after they released a public statement that remained posted for more than a year, falsely stating that he was guilty and had lost the case. As has become quite normal for Doc, he had great difficulty in securing legal representation for his defamation lawsuit, having been essentially blackbanned by retired Chief Justice Judge Wayne Martin, who was threatening disbarment to any lawyers willing to represent Doc, as was revealed later in 2016 by Matt Lever, a law law student at the time who was acting as a middleman between Doc and Jennifer O'Farrell, who was on the Alan McSparan Queensland Greyhound Racing Commission of Inquiry.
So, yeah, they basically said with your family, because my brother's FAS, he's a diplomatic liaison officer in Germany now. So, you know, my sister was talking in Victoria, I'm the only one who didn't serve, and they said, you know, with your family, you think you'd have some more experience about this. That's what they said.
Yeah.
They know you.
They know how big it is. Oh, God.
And they told me to stay out of it. They told me, like, gave me a big tap on the shoulder. They said, if you ever want to pass the bar.
And what was that, the lawyers?
Yeah. So that tells me that
how big
that what it's got is real.
It is real, mate. So how high up did it come? How high up?
A judge.
A judge. So, right, that's why they...
A retired Chief Justice of the West Australian Court, actually, a retired Chief Justice, actually said to me, don't get involved. Literally, they said, if you ever want to pass the bar with your family history, because my dad's actually Director of Operations for ASIO, my brother's a diplomatic liaison officer in Germany, and they said, with your family history, you know, you think you know better, be smarter than that, all this sort of stuff.
So, mate, if Jennifer doesn't...
Jennifer doesn't want it.
Oh, yeah, mate, I know. It's been covered up all the way through.
Yeah, it's completely taken over hand,
Yeah, I knew that. Because I was ticked off that Jennifer was going to be squashed.
Yeah.
And I didn't want...
She's not even part of the commission anymore, not part of the board. She was heading it up.
They pull her out because she would have acted on it.
They gave her a big payout too. They gave her $1 million payout.
Yeah.
Literally $1 million.
Yeah.
And she had to go. No choice. She had to go.
Yeah.
Like they told her.
Yeah.
You either go with the government handshake or you go without.
Yeah.
What she suggested was you need to get to the ABC, you need to get to all the news people.
They've been shut down.
And get them to come to you, but you need to get them talking again.
Yeah.
Matt was forced to stop helping Doc and had to return the evidence he was going to be handing over to Jen on the commission, or suffer never being allowed to pass the bar and become a lawyer.
Matt just gave me this box, so I better be very careful when I open it. Wonder what's in it, mate. See, that's the bike shop there. Right, so I'm not going to open the box, Yo-Yo's lying on it, until I got witnesses around me. I was told that they were going to plant drugs. I was going to be set up with drugs, I was told. But I'm just not going to take no chances because I know now that the orders are coming from judges up high to stop me. So isn't that bad for the legal system? Now I understand why no lawyers will work for me and they shit. Even the big powerful lawyers, they want to run. Otherwise they're going to be black banned. Let's get out of here.
Now, even though the revealing of this came much later after the inquiry, there's no telling how far back Doc was being blocked, because he most certainly was not able to find any lawyer willing to represent him for his defamation lawsuit against the Chiropractors Board of Queensland, until Peter Boyce of Butler McDermott Lawyers showed up to take him on. And of course, Peter was a GRA stooge and saboteur who later turned out to be a lifetime member of Racing Queensland. Later in 2016, one of Doc's clients referred him to Chris Hannay, the director of Hannay Lawyers.
Hi, how you going?
Hi.
I'm happy to talk to you about your matter. Yeah. Your appointment was booked with Chris though. So are you wanting to see Chris?
Well, you could pass it on.
Okay, if you want.
Look, this case is about 6 tentacles, so there's going to end up being 6 separate cases. And that's to do with Racing Queensland, Chiropractor Board of Australia and a lot of other stuff, cover-ups.
The only thing is I represent some individuals involved with Racing Queensland,
yeah, I'm talking about the board.
I may be conflicted.
All right.
That's the only
thing. This is about the board, not the greyhound trainers.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is...
I don't know how much time...
For the rest of this clip, which continues on for about 20 minutes, Doc gives the lawyer a complete rundown of basically everything we've already released in our online media library up to now, and even more. Doc hands over some evidence, including a USB, the contents of which were incriminating for Racing Queensland. He's told that he'll be contacted, and he never hears back from them again. But they still took advantage of Doc's evidence and used it as leverage to advantage their existing clients who were also greyhound people, fighting smaller cases against Racing Queensland.
Racing Queensland?
Okay, yep. So...
Yeah. So
I'll have a look through these and I'll email you and then...
Yeah, you tell me what you want and then, I'll work with you. Anything you want, just email me and say, just say, I'll ring you tomorrow, such and such. I'll have my phone.
No worries.
All right.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, pleasure. All right, we'll talk soon.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
Coming back to the GRA false inquiry, the day after the first hearing was adjourned, Doc was headed for even more harassment. Knowing full well that Doc's greyhounds were to compete in the Mulcahy and Cairns Cups, and that he'd be travelling north the very next day, the GRA scheduled the first hearing in Bundaberg for the 3rd of July. This forced Doc to travel 4.5 hours from Brisbane to Bundaberg, and the return trip after the hearing, straight back to Brisbane, to collect another trainer and his dogs, Wayne Andrews, who the GRA also knew full well was to be travelling north with Doc. With no time to lose, Doc and Wayne got straight back on the road north to Mulcahy that night. 10 a.m. the next morning at Rockhampton, about halfway to Mulcahy, Doc received a call from Rachel Thompson tipping him off that his dogs had been scratched from their upcoming race meetings in both Mulcahy and Cairns. As we previously detailed, Rachel Thompson was Doc's ex-spouse and GRA plant/saboteur, whose mother Jocelyn Thompson was best friends with Kerry Watson. And obviously at this time Rachel was still sitting on the fence between Doc and the GRA, or she probably wouldn't be calling him to give him a tip-off. The fact that it was Rachel calling and not someone from the GRA shows the intent of the GRA to cause anguish to Doc, because they had full knowledge of his travel plans and also that he was to be transporting Wayne Andrews and his dogs. Wayne made a point of informing the GRA of their plans before going ahead. The fact that it was Rachel letting Doc know further shows the connection between Rachel and Kerry Watson, because being that they involved only non-TAB race meetings, meaning local betting only with no details on the internet, there was no other way for her to know, except through Kerry. So with no choice but to turn around and head back, Doc and Wayne had to cancel their plans and pulled up in Bundaberg to try and get the matter sorted out. It turned out that Cameron McClune, the chairman from the first inquiry, had had Doc's greyhounds scratched on the basis that he'd walked out of the inquiry the previous day. Well, let's take a look at the end of the transcript from that day. Here's Cameron McClune, the chairman, wrapping up, asking everyone if there's anything further, Doc asking if he can send in more evidence, Cameron trying to give Doc his contactability and declining, saying, I think we have enough on our plate to deal with tonight, asking once again if there is anything further from anyone, and adjourning. Looks pretty final. Of course, Doc didn't walk out on the inquiry, but any excuse for the GRA to cause anguish for Doc, especially at that time, straight after the Chiropractors Board lawsuit and being in the middle of a GRA inquiry. So by 4:30 that afternoon, after being on the phone back and forth to Cameron and the GRA and the Office of Racing all day, Doc and Wayne finally received confirmation that their dogs would be reinstated for at least the Cairns Cups races. So again, with no time to lose, they get straight back on the road heading north for Cairns. Then by the time they'd reached Townsville, the dogs had been carted around for almost 2 days straight, and one of Wayne's dogs was in a very bad way with gastric. By the time they had reached Cairns, 2 of Wayne's dogs were in no shape to race. Then later that day, having been unable to get a hold of a vet, one of Wayne's dogs, Artie, died. Literally died in his arms. And Wayne's dogs weren't just numbers to him, he was close with his dogs. So this was obviously quite upsetting for Wayne. This was his son's dog, which they had every intention of keeping as a pet. So with no other option, they had to wrap up Artie in plastic and blankets and put him back into the trailer with the other dogs for the trip back to Brisbane.
Well, Wayne, when you left Brisbane, this dog was in excellent condition, wasn't it?
It was in perfect condition.
Well, how do you feel about what's happened to it?
Absolutely upset. If we were able to have gone on to Cairns as originally arranged, instead of being told or
threatened,
this dog's not being able to race, we would have continued on and would have made the journey without any problems, without having to be run around and be put into the situation where it is now.
What's your thoughts about the Racing Authority now? I'm pretty disgusted in it.
Well, they haven't made my life very easy.
As you're aware now that there's corruption with Kerry Watson in the Racing Authority, this is what it's all been about, nothing else.
That's correct.
And that Narelle and Bill from Bundaberg.
A pack of garbage.
We're going to take this further, mate, with the RSPCA, and that this is wrong, because all your other dogs lost condition as well. Mine's down a little bit too, so this is just a lot of crap, and this has got to go further, Wayne.
Well, all the way with you, Doc.
Thank you. This is disgraceful, Wayne. This should never ever happen, and it will never ever happen again, because I am going to take this further, and I know you are too, because this dog was in perfect racing condition when this dog left Brisbane. And we got mucked around by Cameron from the racing authority that we could not race the dogs, and if we went on the track, we'd be in a lot of serious trouble. I was not allowed on there, so I turned around to head back to Brisbane, pleaded with him all day to let the dogs start it, and at the end, he ended up letting it because I said to him, if you had anything to charge me, you better charge me or let the dogs start. So they've let the dogs start. So in that case, there was nothing to answer for in the beginning. And this has got to be taken to the CMC and the Racing Commission because this is happening so often with them. And I'm very disgusted in them. And I have got no respect for them anymore. And I'm Doc Jamieson, the animal healer that cares about greyhounds and everybody else's people. This is my job and my life. And Cameron, Danny Wright and Kerry Watson, this is going further. And I do hope the result comes out and the truth. This is disgraceful.
Now, once again, the GRA knew full well that Wayne was to be travelling north with Doc. Wayne had already spoken directly to the board about it beforehand while nominating his dogs. But neither Doc nor Wayne were notified of the scratching from the GRA, and Artie died as a result of the stress and strain from a trip that was incredibly longer than it should have been, thanks to the GRA. Now, if the reason for the scratching was legitimate, then surely Doc's dogs would not have been reinstated to race, and he would have been charged after supposedly walking out of the inquiry. But there was nothing. So on top of Cameron McClune's indifference towards Doc's greyhounds during the first hearing, as we showed in the previous two videos where Cameron basically held a mid-hearing adjournment to ransom with no consideration for animal welfare, this paints a clearer picture of the complete disregard for duty of care by the GRA and that their top priority was harassing Doc. Despite the incident of Doc's scratching from the Mulcahy and Cairns race meetings being presented in detail during the first Brisbane hearing with Judge Wylie, it was given no consideration at all and wasn't even mentioned in Judge Wylie's reasons for outcome document. So let's dive into that document right now. Section 1 is a brief summary of the complaint and the basis for the inquiry, alleged statements by Doc claiming to be close friends with Danny Ryan, Danny looks after his swabs, etc. Here is where Judge Wylie references the aborting of the first inquiry, as he puts it, and the appointing of himself to conduct a new one. Now here is where we come across the first big problem. Why did the GRA start a whole new inquiry? In his opening on the hearing of the 6th of August, Judge Wylie states that the GRA had determined that, for good reason, the original inquiry was not proceeding and that he was brought in as an impartial chair. But what was the good reason? In a notice from the GRA chair at the time, Phil Bennett, advising Doc of the inquiry reboot, the reason stated was that it was required by the principles of natural justice and fairness in order to achieve an outcome which was impartial and fair to all. Well, that's exactly what should have happened in the first place, so why didn't it? Because, as we've shown in the previous video, the GRA failed to shut down Doc in a single hearing, which turned out to be a circus, with both members of the panel, John Doss and Inquiry Chairman Cameron McClune, coming directly under scrutiny of the inquiry itself, so they had to come up with a plan B, hence a fresh inquiry and a new inquiry chairman. However, this is still nothing even close to being a fair and impartial inquiry at all. It's still a GRA inquiry, it's not an Office of Racing inquiry or a court of law, and the GRA are flipping the bill for Judge Wylie's time. Section 2 clearly shows Judge Wylie's access to audio tapes of the first inquiry was readily available, but as we just showed you earlier, the privilege was not afforded to Doc for any of the hearings. Sections 3 and 4 bring in the mention of all the witnesses from the first inquiry, none of whom were anywhere to be seen for the remaining hearings. But given that any claim to legitimacy the first inquiry had rested solely upon their testimony, and also that their testimony was given weight in the new inquiry, Doc should have had the opportunity to question them comprehensively. But he never did, because as we thoroughly showed in the previous video, Cameron shut him down at every turn. So for Judge Wylie to say here that Doc had extensively questioned all the witnesses was stretching the truth at best. Section 4 goes into the swab scandal at Bundaberg, where John Doss had said to Doc about Danny excluding his greyhound Winsome Master from swabbing, and which John denied having ever said. This, of course, was the incident where Bill and Narelle already knew that Doc's greyhound wasn't swabbed and questioned him about it upon returning from the kennel block, prompting Doc to mention swabbing and Danny Ryan's name in the same sentence, all in order to have some kind of basis they could use to twist into the main allegation. John actually tried to escape being caught in a lie by first saying that he was talking to Danny about another matter altogether. Then he tried to change the narrative of the accusation with the redundant point that he wouldn't have a phone on the track. Then sometime after the inquiry, John contradicts himself by changing his story when Doc confronts him.
And then that day when Winston Master got swabbed, and I said to you to the swab room, and you just said, Danny Ryan rang this morning and said, what's Doc Jamieson doing up there with Winston Master? He's a class dog swab, don't swab him. I walked back, I said to swab him, he said, not swabbing. I walked back, all I done is I said to them, they said to me, how come you never got swabbed? I said, ask John Doss. He said, Danny Ryan rang in this morning and said, don't swab him. I repeated what you said, and then they turned it around and said that I said that Danny Ryan's a mate of mine, he looked after me swabs. John, that's not what I said.
I don't say anything anyone out here.
What? No, I know what they're like, John. And then you said it in the inquiry it didn't, but you know what? I know Danny Ryan's your boss, I understand.
Danny didn't tell me not to swab the dog. Danny said to me, well, I queried the time, and it wasn't early morning, it was after 8. And Danny Ryan said to me, the dog's quite capable of running that sort of time. It's a good dog.
Right, well, John, how come I never got swabbed when I had a big bet on him and he ran flying time?
I don't know. I mean, I probably had used all the swab up for the day or something. I don't know.
Well, you've swabbed me every other time, and I don't mind that, mate. You can swab me every time, but you know, John, even Rachel, the photo lady, was there and heard you say it to me.
And here we have Judge Wylie taking the very same direction as Danny and Cameron did in the first inquiry, that of steering well away from any question of why John Doss could or would be lying. The next two sections is where Judge Wylie details his consideration of Doc's swab history, although with zero regard for the logic it represents, being that it would make no logical sense for Doc to be claiming any right of exemption from being swabbed on Danny Ryan's authority. But of course, we already know what Judge Wylie's aim is here, that being to massage the evidence to fit the outcome of a guilty verdict. Sections 9 to 12 give a summary of the complaint by Danny Ryan, focusing on the main allegation and again, taking the same direction as Danny and Cameron did in keeping focus on Danny not having authority to exempt any dogs from being swabbed, with again, no regard at all either way for whether or not Doc would actually claim that Danny would have such authority, let alone claiming any special favours from him. The fact that Danny has no authority to affect the swab process is irrelevant because it assumes Doc is already guilty. So even though Judge Wylie is much more eloquent and graceful in his delivery, the absurdity of the allegation remains unaddressed, and it's all Judge Wylie can do to keep the focus far away from that question and just simply overwhelm the subject with as much eloquent dialogue as possible to give his verdict some appearance of legitimacy. But it's all just hot air. Sections 13 to 15 give a summary of the testimony of Jo Rowe from the first inquiry, with Judge Wylie giving credence to her account of what Doc supposedly said to her regarding reporting to Danny Ryan. Now, Jo's testimony isn't really given any floor time in the Brisbane inquiries, and besides, there wasn't a lot Doc could challenge her with at the time. She was a last-minute witness who was very clearly unwillingly pulled into being a false witness, and almost certainly she was under duress, most likely of losing her employment. But we already thoroughly discredited her testimony using the conversation she had with Doc after the inquiry had ended. Once again, see the previous video for much greater detail on this. Sections 16 to 17 are a summary and acceptance of Bill Samuel's testimony, but again, with no regard whatsoever for Doc's evidence of Bill's history and character or argument for why Bill would give false testimony. As with the first inquiry, any evidence Doc puts forward is completely disregarded. So even though it's a new inquiry chairman who handles himself with calm and grace, it's still the same game, just with slightly different tact. The next few sections are basically the same trope, just with Narelle Mulcahy instead of Bill. Judge Wylie gives full weight to Narelle's testimony and again completely disregards Doc's evidence because it destroys Narelle's credibility altogether. Fortunately, we've already done this comprehensively in the previous video, clearly establishing her motive to collude in setting up Doc in a false inquiry, as well as thoroughly corroborating her quite odious character as a dishonest troublemaker, who was very unhappy with Doc being the superior trainer, winning almost all of his races and taking all the prize money. The last part of section 23 is surprisingly and completely incorrect. Judge Wylie states that Doc never directly questioned Narelle about her being on the phone to Rachel, saying that she was going to set him up. But here it is right here. The next 9 sections are solely focused on elevating Rachel Thompson as the quote-unquote most credible witness, which is quite preposterous because Rachel is, without a doubt, the witness with the least amount of credibility. The first section here gives a relatively accurate, although generic, summary of the history between Doc and Rachel prior to events leading up to the inquiry. Then here at section 25 we come upon the first and most prominent issue, which is Judge Wylie's unquestioning acceptance of the undated statement which was supposedly written by Rachel approximately 6 weeks prior to her giving testimony in the inquiry. Now, if Rachel was the most credible witness, with a statement written 2 weeks prior to the first inquiry, surely she would have been present for the first hearing on the 3rd of July, or at the very least just her statement submitted as evidence, which very suspiciously corroborates almost exactly everything that was put forward against Doc in the first inquiry. And if any of it were true, then surely it would have been the most damning evidence against Doc that could have possibly been used in the first inquiry. But of course, none of it was true, nor was it used in the first inquiry, probably because it didn't even exist yet.
I was just so angry that I was set up in the inquiry with Kerry Watson and that false statement that you made. I shouldn't even...
I didn't make any statement.
Yes, what, you didn't do a statement?
No, I didn't do any statement.
What, to the GRA?
Yeah, I didn't do any statement.
Well, who done that?
No, I don't even know what you're talking about.
From section 26, this is where things become incredibly convenient for the side against Doc. Firstly, the vast majority of Rachel's testimony corroborates that of Bill and Narelle and Joe Rowe, basically to a T. There are things like Doc claiming to be best friends with Danny Ryan, Doc claiming to be having a regular coffee with Danny, Doc claiming to have Danny in his pocket for getting himself out of being swabbed at the races and other trouble, Doc pretending to be on the phone to Danny, all the things we thoroughly discredited in the previous video as being drastically out of character and completely illogical. All of these items Judge Wylie is perfectly happy to accept as credible testimony. But as for everything else, the judge makes very certain to steer well away from any mention of Rachel's credibility being compromised by Doc's arguments and evidence, because they most certainly do compromise Rachel's credibility, most notably regarding Rachel's handwritten notes and letters to her family which she gave to Doc as evidence, and which we'll get to in a moment. Section 26 shows Judge Wylie doing the same thing again, keeping focus on an invalid point, that of there never having been any witness of Doc having coffee with Danny, which again assumes Doc's guilt and completely ignores the question of whether or not Doc would actually make such an absurd claim, without allowing Doc's character, any logic, or any of Doc's arguments to weigh in. In sections 27 to 29, the judge mentions Rachel's corroboration of the testimony of the witnesses from the first inquiry. Rachel references numerous events that did actually take place, however, with elaborate fabrication of false details added in, so that they appear to align with what Doc is alleged to have said and done, as well as the telling of some events that never actually happened. Section 30 talks about the incident where Doc scratched his dogs from a Rockhampton race meeting due to a breakdown, with Rachel stating that it was on a fraudulent basis, although in her version of events, he was in Brisbane. In Bill and Narelle's version, he was at home in Bargara. Judge Wylie doesn't mention this contradiction, but he does state that he left the incident out of his consideration, even on what he calls the important issue of Ms. Thompson's credibility, which he otherwise never makes an issue of. Wonder why? The next two sections bring in Doc's assertions that it was Kerry Watson who had arranged for him to be framed in the inquiry, and his attempting to cross-examine Rachel to prove it. The judge is dismissive of any suggestion of Kerry Watson's involvement, as well as any question of Rachel's credibility, because by that point, with the evidence provided to the judge, the question of Rachel's credibility is sticking out like a sore thumb, but Judge Wylie still hasn't addressed it at all, and he won't, because his job here is to make Rachel appear as credible as possible. For starters, the fact that Rachel is Doc's aggrieved ex-spouse makes her testimony dubious at best, and not able to be relied upon without thorough cross-examination of which there was none. There was Rachel's letters to her family indicating Kerry Watson's involvement in her affairs with Doc, as well as the physical abuse she had suffered from her father Peter, which was blamed on Doc. And Rachel's handwritten notes are probably the most incriminating of all, because they show Rachel's duress under threat of being charged with the CMC, something that was used as essentially a boogeyman by Cameron McLean and her mother to pull her away from being on side with Doc. That she knew about Doc's greyhounds being scratched from the Mulcahy and Cairns race meetings, which is how she was able to tip off Doc about it. Kerry Watson and Danny Ryan's involvement in setting up Doc. Kerry Watson's reminder to Rachel to be careful what she said around Liz Murray, a GRA registrar with whom Doc actually had genuine rapport because she was the only person he knew in the GRA with any level of integrity. How Cameron was to filter evidence in the first inquiry, and Bill and Narelle's involvement in the whole charade. All of these were provided by Doc to the judge, but none of it was given any credence because it was all too incriminating for the GRA, who was flipping the bill for Judge Wylie's time to the tune of around some $1,500 an hour. Then in section 33, despite Rachel being the witness with the most staggering amount of evidence against her, Judge Wylie states with finality that Rachel Thompson was the most credible witness and that there was no reason to question her testimony. Section 34 brings in Doc's witness Barry Mayer, who was brought in to support Doc's version of events and invalidate Rachel's, and also to further support that Doc never used a mobile phone at the races. The judge accepts the evidence of Doc's practice of leaving his mobile phone in his car when at the races, but fails to address at all the issue of Rachel's challenged credibility. Incidentally, Mrs. Green, the wife of Matt Green, one of Doc's supporting witnesses from the first inquiry, was also brought in as a witness whose testimony brought Rachel's credibility strongly into question during directly challenging Rachel's account of events, and firmly supporting the absence of any sign of abusive relationship between Rachel and Doc. But Judge Wylie makes no mention of this whatsoever in his reasons for outcome. Section 35 is of great concern because it entirely dismisses crucial evidence provided by Doc, namely a statement by Rosemary Nissen-Wade, who firmly corroborates the fact that Doc was having car trouble as a reason for the Rockhampton scratching, which directly opposes Rachel's statement and testimony and challenges Rachel's credibility, but the judge deems it as being of no assistance. This next section references evidence provided to the judge of recorded conversations between Doc and Rachel that took place sometime after the first inquiry and before the Brisbane inquiry took place. The conversation confirmed that Rachel was fully aware of how the GRA had set up Doc, that Danny had been trying to find something on Doc for 5 years, and also that Rachel had burned evidence crucial to incriminating Kerry Watson. Judge Wylie did the job he was enlisted to do and dismissed it all, saying that there was nothing said to change his view. No surprises there. When the tapes were returned to Doc, they had been wiped clean. But the main reason Doc submitted the recordings was so that the judge would be aware that Doc knew exactly what was going on behind the scenes of the inquiry. It seems highly likely that these recordings made it to Danny Ryan's ears before being returned to Doc, because Danny wanted to pull the pin on the whole inquiry and let Doc walk on the day of the final hearing. More on that in a moment. One of the most critical pieces of evidence that was completely left out of proceedings was a 30-page statement by Rachel, which was provided to the judge at the beginning of the Brisbane inquiry. Now, save for official investigations where sensitive information is kept confidential, because this is a public release, we can't show most of the contents of the document in this video because it would violate the privacy of many individuals mentioned herein who have nothing to do with the false inquiry. Nonetheless, Judge Wylie had this evidence and gave it no consideration. The document gives a highly nuanced account of Rachel Thompson's life leading up to and including her time in her relationship with Doc, mainly detailing how Rachel was constantly in great fear for her children's and her own safety under the threat of extreme domestic violence by her ex-partner, Graham Fletcher. As a result of radical jealousy at Graham's hands, Doc sustained damage to his property, being publicly defamed in the town where he lived, the theft of all the furniture and belongings from his home, and the poisoning of 2 of his dogs. Most importantly, however, was the incident in which Rachel, under extreme duress and fear for the lives of herself and her children, under Graham's coercion, made a false police report against Doc. And because Doc was basically the polar opposite of Graham, Rachel had literally nothing to say against him, so all she could do was detail the abuse she'd suffered from Graham for the past 9 years and just put Doc's name in place of Graham's on the police report. So the GRA inquiry wasn't the first time that Rachel had made a false statement against Doc, sad as it was. So again, under duress from the threat of being charged with the CMC as detailed in Rachel's handwritten notes, which would also cause Rachel to fear for the loss of her children, Judge Wylie had everything he needed to completely disregard Rachel's testimony as not being credible. But of course, Judge Wylie made no mention whatsoever about this critical evidence. Section 37 references a recorded conversation with Eric Haldane, which, if nothing else, supports Doc's character as well as the unlikelihood that Doc would ever say anything to the effect of the allegations. But again, Judge Wylie dismisses it, saying that it contained nothing of value. Section 38 is where Doc's witnesses David Keep and Beryl Green are mentioned. The testimony of these witnesses sheds a blinding light on the lack of integrity and the corrupt practices of the GRA, as well as the level to which corruption is covered up by the regulatory bodies which govern the racing industry.
So, when I come out of the jail and that wrong dog got raised, I ring up Debbie Rogers, well, that means to say you've got a scratch. That dog for its previous 3 runs that I gave it, plus the other dog, it's 2 runs I gave it, so that's 5 dogs that got me disqualified.
Yes.
I said the prize money that dog won at Albion Park, I have to give that back, right? None of that happened. They covered all that up. I didn't get fined 1 penny or even asked to attend to an inquiry. The bloke that raced the dog at Gold Coast wasn't fined. He was given a reprimanded check. He got the right dog in future. My wife signed the first lot of documents and was never asked to sign new documents, so they were signed. The documents were incorrect too, right?
Yep.
Instead of scratching all them dogs, they went and changed their names. They turned Rick Petite into Wacky Frog and Wacky Frog into Rick Petite and issued new papers.
Wow.
Can you
Yeah.
We covered this scandal in depth in a previous video, The Wrong Dogs, available to view on our website, phoenixtaskforce.org. Once again, nothing of any substance to see here from Judge Wylie in regards to any of this, because it's all too damning for the GRA. Section 39 references the one incident in particular that emerged in the inquiry to challenge the credibility of Danny Ryan and his assertion that he has no power over the swabbing process, with the statement of an ex-GRA steward, Bob Watkins, stating that during a race meeting at the Gold Coast, Danny had told him to scratch and swab all of David Keep's dogs over a honeyed muzzle incident. When challenged on this, Danny simply called Bob a liar. Bob, who made this statement on audio tape record, but the judge conveniently omits the word swabbing, only mentioning the word scratching, failing to weigh the credibility of Danny or the GRA at all, and in Section 40 dismisses the evidence entirely.
I can give you one case where at Gold Coast, Bob Watkins rang up back to the board
Yep.
and got instructions over the phone from Ryan. He was told he could scratch all my dogs and swab them, right?
Yeah.
And this is all on tape because there was an inquiry up the meeting.
Yes.
It was about putting honey on the muzzle. We had an official inquiry after the last at the Gold Coast.
Yep.
And this is when I asked Watkins, I told you to scratch my dogs and swab them all. He said, Danny Ryan. I said, that's dogs nominated and raced by Beryl Green. He said next to me. I said, that had nothing to do with me. That dog was all settled up. I was just giving up putting the boxes for him. So anyway, I rang up Ryan. He said, I didn't say that. I said, well, Bob Watkins said that you were the person who gave the that he could do it, right?
Mm.
So he said, Bob Watkins is the biggest fucking liar he said I've ever met. Danny Ryan said, right?
Yep.
So I got off the phone from Danny Ryan, you asked Bob Watkins.
Yep.
I rang Bob Watkins up and said to him, I said, hey, Danny Ryan reckons you're the biggest fucking liar that ever lived. He never said that to you. And he said, well, he said, I'm telling you, he did say it to me, right? Hello?
Bob.
Yeah.
Doc Jamieson, mate, how are you?
Yeah, right, Doc.
Listen, I got a front up tomorrow. I got a phone call from Dave Keep, and Dave Keeps gave me a lot of stuff. That's what's happened when Danny Ryan called you a fucking liar, you know, when his dogs were scratched. This is bullshit, mate, how they cover stuff up. And you know yourself, mate, it's got to stop.
Well, the biggest thing is that I did have that on safety on there that day.
Yep.
With Beryl and David Keep and everything else.
Yep.
And, well, mate, I know very well that I spoke to Steve McGrath and Danny Ryan that afternoon, and they told me what I had to do. Yeah. He wants to call me a liar, like I was down there on Monday night and raced Marky's dog, and I walked in there and said hello to him. He just looked straight through me, so, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Mate, that's fucking Danny Ryan.
He treated me like shit. And same as Phil Bennett said, get away from me, you've cost us a lot of money. I haven't cost them nothing, mate. The allegations are false, they've colluded the evidence, and I've got the proof. And now, isn't it funny that Dave Keeps come out and there's others that's coming out in the woodwork now that wants to stand to prove how much Danny Ryan colludes evidence?
With Section 41 being a generic statement to dismiss Doc's evidence, we jump over to Section 42 referencing where Kerry Watson and Liz Murray were brought in as witnesses during the final hearing. Kerry Watson came in to defend herself against Doc's allegations and blatantly lied about her appearance at the Beenleigh courts on the day Doc won his case against the Chiropractors Board of Queensland. As witnessed by journalist Gregory Stolz, Kerry was outside the court actively defaming Doc by brandishing photos of Rachel Thompson's injuries from her abusive father Peter Thompson, claiming that it was Doc who was responsible for the abuse. The remainder of Kerry's testimony was a generic dismissal of all the allegations that she was the main perpetrator behind setting up Doc in the false inquiry. But even with Rachel's credibility challenged and her handwritten notes to support Kerry's guilt, the judge fails to address this at all. And of course he never would. Remember, this is still a GRA inquiry, not a court of law, and the GRA is paying Judge Wylie for his time. How can you have a so-called impartial inquiry held by an authority that's essentially inquiring into itself and its own corruption? You can't, because then there's nothing impartial about it. Are you beginning to see the core problem here? Liz Murray's testimony effectively caught out Rachel in a lie when she stated having not called Liz in regards to warning her of a trap set by Danny Ryan. Again, the judge fails to make any mention of this. And finally, at the end, we have the guilty verdict. Nowhere in this document are a number of vital issues mentioned, such as the harassment of Doc by the GRA with the scratching of his dogs and subsequent death of Wayne Andrews' greyhound Artie, the conflict of interest having Cameron McLean participating in proceedings as record keeper, especially after Doc's assertion of Cameron's acts of harassment after the first hearing with his dogs being scratched as penalty for something that never happened, or Rachel's notes showing that Cameron and Rachel knew each other after Cameron had claimed that he didn't know who Rachel was, or even the fact that Cameron was the chairman of the initial inquiry and the absurdity of having a fresh one if Cameron was to be involved in proceedings all over again. The question of the credibility of the witnesses from the first inquiry, Bill, Narelle and Joe, as shown in the previous video, Kerry Watson and Liz Murray showing up as surprise witnesses at the final hearing, allowing Doc no time to properly prepare his defence, the GRA's failure to provide transcripts for previous hearings, again not allowing Doc to properly prepare his defence, the fact that the first inquiry went ahead as it did in the first place with the conflicts of interest of the panel members John Doss and Cameron McLean being Danny Ryan's subordinates, or that Doc was never initially notified of the details of the complaint, or the witnesses who would be attending, or that John Doss was allowed to remain on the panel after becoming implicated in the swab scandal, all of which show the underhanded conduct of the GRA, and Rachel's credibility remains completely unchallenged despite the astonishing amount of evidence and witness testimony brought in to compromise it. It didn't matter that Rachel's credibility was pragmatically destroyed, and that the only basis left upon which Doc could be charged was essentially nothing but hearsay. Although Doc was given more latitude to present his case than he was allowed in the first inquiry, by the end of it all, his arguments and evidence were still effectively dismissed or ignored, with the judge steering the narrative of the reasons for outcome in favour of a guilty verdict. However, it turned out that Judge Wylie did have something of a conscience. During an adjournment on the final day of the hearing, Judge Wylie informed Doc off the record that Danny was ready to pull the pin, saying that Doc no longer had any charges to answer for. But Doc wasn't going to let them off the hook and insisted on continuing through to the end, because after all he'd been through, there was no way he was going to let everything be covered up, and he was determined to get the truth out. Even after the inquiry, once the room was emptied of everyone except for Doc and the judge, Judge Wylie spoke candidly with Doc and told him what he really thought. He said that his hands were tied, that the inquiry was a kangaroo court, that the decision for the outcome went over his head, that Doc should take the matter to the CMC or the Supreme Court, and that there was at least 3 different grounds on which he could appeal. Now, although the record of Judge Wylie's reasoning for his decision was in the sure event that there was to be an appeal, ever since the inquiry, despite Doc's repeated formal applications and following of due process, the GRA, ongoing today as Racing Queensland, has never allowed for an appeal to take place. Even during the inquiry, he was blocked from acquiring legal representation when the GRA, who was informed of exactly who Doc intended to enlist as his solicitor, created a conflict of interest by discussing the case with the very same solicitor.
Hello, it's Doc Jamieson here. Who am I speaking with?
Tracy?
Yeah, Tracy, when you rang me, I was a little bit lost with sort of understanding why Mr. Murdoch couldn't take my case. Could you just make it clear to me again, if you don't mind?
Before you called, he had spoken to somebody about that particular matter, and it would be a conflict of interest. Once he has spoken to some person about it, he's not given any person advice, and he isn't acting for anybody in this particular matter. But once you've actually spoken to somebody about it, the other side about it, it's regarded as a conflict to then speak to the other side about it.
What do you mean the other side, the GRA?
Yes.
Okay.
So if they have approached him to act for them and have spoken about the case, whether he's taking that matter or not, he can't then act for your side.
Okay, it's just strange that the GRA knew that I was going to get Jimmy Murdoch.
Really?
Yeah.
He was blocked again when attempting to get evidence through to the judge, with the GRA ignoring him and failing to return his calls, forcing him to reach out to the judge through his horse racing connections. After the inquiry, Doc reached out to the Office of Racing an astounding number of times, but with his email correspondence all he got was the runaround, and with his evidence submission and subsequent show cause notices, he was ignored altogether. So it should come as no surprise that the Office of Racing was already aware that Doc was going to be facing a false inquiry after Rachel, at a time when she was still on side with Doc, 3 months prior to the first inquiry, called the office and spoke to John Patterson to get them to step in before it could happen. But of course, they sat on their hands all the way through and for years afterwards. In 2013, during an evidence submission campaign, Doc delivered multiple evidence packages directly to the Attorney General at the time, Jared Bleasher, and the Office of Racing, who were located in the same building. During one of his deliveries, the Office of Racing admitted to being aware of Kerry Watson's involvement behind the scenes of the false inquiry on Doc, and also advised that they would pass on the evidence to the Attorney General. But 10 years on, nothing has been done.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm unable to take your call. If you'd like to leave a message with your phone number, I'll give you a call back as soon as I can.
From
Thank you.
upstairs about the inquiry. Yeah. I got stuff off the other day about that inquiry.
Racing inquiry.
Yeah. Remember I was over here with the JP?
Yeah.
I got some more documents, so I got to drop it. And also the Attorney General, I got some stuff to drop to him as well.
With his, it all has to be mailed.
Because I've got the same stuff as I've got for Jodie.
Well, she might.
She might be. I'll pass it on, eh?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Just put
floor one, isn't it?
Yeah, floor one.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. All right. Yeah, remember I dropped the papers off today. Yes. Yep. More stuff. I've got also stuff at the Jen I went up to his north side office last week because I didn't have a job.
No, leave it with me.
And if you want me, I've got on my message bank, you can't leave a message because I'm sick of the death threats.
Okay.
If you email me,
Yep, sure.
not a problem.
Yeah.
And I'll show you some other stuff I've got
Yep,
as well now. Just get sick of being bullied, you know.
Yep, no, I can understand that.
And, you know, I've said before, I had 13 dogs poisoned in cat, like that attempts on me. It's been going on for years, you know. And it's got to stop. I'll put it together as best I could for you, okay?
Great.
So there's the dish, there's a lot of stuff on there. There's heaps of stuff there, transcripts.
Yep.
Can you give it to the Attorney General? I gave you a lot of the transcripts the other day. I just want to show you something.
Yep, sure.
This is going to show you I'm not wasting your time, okay? Or the Attorney General, or there's the transcripts, all the tapes.
Yep.
Tapes don't lie.
Have you, I suppose I'm just going to ask you a question.
Yeah, whatever.
Have you, like I know there's a Racing Integrity Commissioner and there's an Animal Welfare Board and
Been
so
there.
forth. You've been there?
And Gary Watson was the chair of the board.
Yep.
Was actually my ex-partner's mum's best friend.
Yeah, no,
That's
I'm
where
aware
it
of
all.
that. Yeah, no,
That's
I'm
where
aware
it
of
all.
that. Yeah, no,
That's
I'm
where
aware
it
of
all.
that. Yeah, no,
That's
I'm
where
aware
it
of
all
that.
stemmed from.
Yep.
And I found out about sexual abuse from the father, and they wanted to get rid of me.
Yep.
And that's where it all stemmed from. And she went to the chiropractor board of Queensland and opened an inquiry at the same time. Danny Ryan and Narelle came out to my place and warned me, which I really appreciate. And I got set up in the false inquiry in 2007, and everybody knows about it. And you know, everything's there.
All right, I'll just get you to sign that and I'll take a photocopy.
Yep. Just give me a second. And whatever you want, I can get.
Yep, okay.
Same as the
All right.
Attorney General.
Thanks, Mel.
Yeah. But you know, I just want the truth there. It's,
Okay.
and,
All right, well, I'll see you out.
All right.
And despite being the most blatant example of the denial of natural justice, with far-reaching implications beyond just the greyhound racing industry, and well into the realm of public interest, with the petitioning of thousands of individuals to have it addressed and fixed, every government office, every regulatory and law enforcement body, every minister, senator, attorney and governor-general, everyone that Doc has formally contacted and submitted evidence to, with the power and professional responsibility to open an investigation, has either sat back and rested on their laurels, or actively worked to pervert the course of justice. For example, in 2014, when Doc attended the mediation for his defamation lawsuit against the Chiropractors Board of Queensland, the legal team on the other side tried to squash his expectations and force him to take the pathetically small compensation they were offering, while his forensic accountant, sitting right next to him with the proof right there in his bag of millions of dollars in damages, just sat there and wouldn't even speak up.
Okay guys, so what I want to do now is I want to explain a few little things to you. I went into that mediation. As you're aware, I got knocked unconscious just before the mediation. That was to try and silence me and make me go away, which, you know, after one day I signed myself out of hospital. See, what happened is I got a phone call from a very good cop from high up that's been tipping me off over the years. And he told me to record the mediation because it's all been set up, and for me to reveal what's going on behind closed doors. And that's what I'm doing. You know, I gave him every chance to pay me. My forensic accountant there, his bill was over $30,000, and he was taking notes for the other side. Now, he wasn't the forensic accountant supposed to be working for me, and he had 500 of those hits, website hits, in his bag. There were 700 I had, but they said $50,000 for 12 hits. So if you work it out, they put a price on per hit now, $6,000 odd per hit. So anyway, he said he couldn't talk. Now, I had a barrister in there, that Patrick McCavity, right? Now, he never said a word, see? So lucky that I recorded. And this is why now. I'm revealing everything because I've had enough. I'm not going away. You've righted me from day dot. You know, my animals have been killed and you know, I had over $100,000 stolen out of my bank account. I had my motorhome stolen after this mediation. But, you know, I'm just so grateful to the cops up high that are just waiting for this to blow open, and they're going to come forward and knock their ivory tower down. Because you imagine the other people that this has happened to that we don't even hear about. So, as you know, it's not about the money anymore. It's about cleaning up the dirty system. So anyway, I'm going to reveal now. Everything's coming out. I don't care about their dirty money or their intimidation or whatever. They've taken everything from me. They can't hurt me anymore, and they're not going to hurt anybody else. And people are going to see the truth. You know, and it's not a threat, it's absolute promise. Because, guys, I've had a friggin' enough of being shafted, haven't you? By all government departments and their bullying and their victimisation and their lies. You wait and see.
We'll be blowing this wide open in a future video. So there you have it. A video presentation showing the corruption of a corrupt organisation that ironically ended up having the light of its own inquiry turned around and shone back on itself and its own corruption because they picked a fight with the wrong man. They pulled in the chiropractors board who failed to silence Doc and then failed to do it themselves, causing every other relevant government department and body of regulation to get pulled into it so that the corruption of all these organisations could be revealed too. Well, good job. Thanks, Racing Queensland. Before we wrap things up, here's a little Easter egg. Queenslanders will remember Paul Pisasale, the former mayor of Ipswich. What they probably don't know is that Paul's brother-in-law, Chris Williams, was the president of the Ipswich Greyhound Racing Club during the time that an extraordinary amount of club money mysteriously went missing. Chris Williams was associated with a lot of sketchy dealings during his time as club president, much to the dismay of the Ipswich Greyhound Racing community, only to later become a member of the Queensland Greyhound Racing Board in 2013. During Doc's last dog showing at the Ekka, Chris was the announcer for the judge who pulled Doc out of first place after Kerry Watson yelled out her objection over the crowd in the moment Doc was about to receive the award. This shows the power and influence Kerry had even within Paul Pisasale's circle. Paul Pisasale was behind a lot of the obstacles Doc came up against while working to expose the corruption of the greyhound racing industry. This next clip is from a phone conversation with Doc's clients, Mr. Paul Knox and Mrs. Marina Knox, Paul Pisasale's niece.
All right, just stay positive. We're doing the best we can.
Yeah, we are. We're staying pretty positive. It's just a bit upsetting sometimes, but we're staying positive overall anyway.
Yeah, and did you tell her that you told me about Paul? Yeah, that's no big deal, mate.
No, well, Marina doesn't really like to tell many people because if you say that, they just automatically think you're close with them. So she doesn't tell many people because they tend to judge because she's related to him. But
yeah, well, I don't because I just know it was a personal vendetta with Paul and me because I was revealing the greyhound corruption, that's all.
Yeah, I know, which is wrong.
Nothing to do with anybody else like yous and I don't judge people anyway, mate. I know you
wouldn't anyway. And we both said, and Marina said, I want to be honest with John because he's had so much, because Paul's tried to do so much to him. So she just said, I want to be honest with him in case he finds out through someone else, you know.
Yeah. When's he due out of jail?
Oh, I wouldn't have a clue. Do you know when Paul's due out of jail, Doc?
I think it's October next year.
She said she thinks it's October next year. Maybe.
Yeah, I just hope he backs off, and doesn't cause any more drama with me. All it was because of the greyhound industry and because of the race fixing and all that, see, and I knew that Paul was the one that put the hit on me because I was told, you know. But he used to do that anyway to people, mate, eh? He used to get the thugs after him, you know?
Yeah, it's freaking shocking. It's just the corruption in all politics, and it's disgusting. It really is. Yeah, and like Marina said, he was power hungry.
Yeah, he was. And, you know, I was telling you about when I lived at Willow Bank near the aeroplanes there, and I put in for a kennel licence, and they put me forms back in the mailbox, and the dog guy come and saw me off the record and said, this is not normal protocol. Paul Pisasale put a block on it. You know, like, so he had some power, through everywhere, mate, and he had all the cops on side at Yamanto. When I went to, is it Babel or something?
Babel.
Yeah. So I went in there to the cops in there with some stuff because I was being attacked, my cars were being targeted, everything, and my animals being poisoned. And then she said, the cop there says, just hang on a minute. And she went away and she come back and she said, my boss just told me to tell you, do not go to Yamanto police because Paul Pisasale is involved there, you know? Crazy.
It's friggin', you know what? It really is terrible. I'm just hoping that everything comes out with all these politicians and all these big companies. I hope it all comes out and everything is exposed because it's time that all this shit, it's got to stop, eh?
All right. You know what makes me angry, mate? I'm out there saving friggin' animals and I'm being attacked left, right and centre, you know?
Which makes it even madder because you're saving animals' lives and you're doing such a good thing. You're giving hope to people that have lost all hope.
Oh, absolutely. And I was cleaning the greyhound industry up to stop the race fixing. You know, that's good for the industry, not bad.
Absolutely.
You know,
but I truly believe Source Spirit's protecting you because you're doing a good thing.
Definitely, mate, definitely.
You'll always have our support, mate.
Yeah, no, that's good, mate. All right, well, you have a good day.
No worries, John. Thanks again, mate.
Okay, mate, pleasure. Talk soon.
See ya. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too, mate. Bye.
Bye.
If you're a member of the public or the honest greyhound racing community, go to phoenixtaskforce.org and sign the petition to help us expose the truth of greyhound racing corruption and clean up and reform the industry to stop the needless killing of the animals and the greyhounds. If you've got dirt on greyhound racing industry corruption, we can help get it out there into the eyes of the public. Get in touch with us at admin@phoenixtaskforce.org. Stay tuned because we've got plenty more corruption to expose in future videos, and this won't be over until the truth has been fully revealed and natural justice has been served. Thanks for watching. God bless.